He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 27 years of experience. Together, we are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Today, Henry, we've got 2 guests, both from Canada. They are senior leadership officials with APG Canada, and they will introduce themselves. Let's join the conversation. Okay, Henry, we're back for another episode of the Brief Brothers. Today, we have a first today. We've never had 2 guests at once.
No,
so that's kind of a...
What about the Better Briefs guys?
Oh my goodness, I forgot about that. Okay, so this is the second time we've had two guests at once. I did forget about that. Yeah, that was Matt Davies and Peter Paul Von Wheeler who were talking about their survey on the creative brief. So yes, clearly a reminder. We have with us today Mark Tomblin and Michelle Lee, who are senior leadership of APG Canada, which stands for those of you who don't know, the Account Planning Group. And I guess one of the first questions I want to ask you would be, do you call yourselves account planners or do you call yourselves strategists? Is there much difference?
We're starting there,
one.
are we?
That one. Okay. Yeah. Michelle, why don't you go first?
Well, apparently, if you call yourself a planner, you age yourself. So I'm a strategist.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, obviously, given yes, I'm horribly many decades older than Michelle, so I'm going for planner.
Okay. All right.
So I came up as a planner, but now I call myself a strategist because even though I hate the evolving nature of titles in advertising, because I think it's ridiculous. I do think it provides a little bit of separation between us and the media planners, because I get a ton of media inquiries all the time. And I'm like, well, I'm not a media planner, I'm an account planner, and they don't know what the difference is. And so now, say strategist, creative strategist, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I will cut the Gordian knot on this one. I mean, I think it's best to just treat them as synonyms and then move on.
Yeah. Well, Mark, why don't we start with you? And since you are the chair of APG Canada, why don't we, and I'm going to ask this of both of you, give us a little history of you and how you got into the world of advertising. Did you start off in one direction and move into another? How did you end up as a strategist or a planner and then a strategist? And how did you get into the leadership position?
Okay. I mean, I'll try and keep this brief. I left university, I'm going to be prepared to fall over, in 1981. So that dates me horribly. And actually, I got into advertising by chance. I actually wanted to work for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, but I failed to get onto their training scheme by the skin of my teeth. So I was left sort of jobless. And in fact, my mum suggested advertising as something I might consider. The rest, as they say, is history. I started at, now here's one for the 2 of you. Do you remember the names Benton and Bowles?
Yes.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there you go. See, the instant dating.
I'm older than you are, Mark. I'm older than you are. So.
Well, you don't look it, Howard, is all I'm prepared to say to you.
Not my new best friend.
No, but Benton and Bowles' London office was, really a very middle of the road agency in the early 80s. But a couple of things were noticeable. One is I think I was the only trainee. This dates me. There were 6 graduate trainees in the days when agencies used to have such things. I was the only one who'd never ever seen the industry magazine, because I, as I say, I got there through happenstance. And that was the beginning of 10 more or less enjoyable years. I went as an account management trainee because really in those days very few agencies trained planners, and that's still largely the case. I spent 10 years in account management and enjoyed it, as I say, most of the time. But I had a kind of epiphany about 10 years later when I actually was made redundant during the early recession of the early 90s. I lost my job and I was thinking about what to do next. And I came back via a small management consultancy as a planner. And to be honest, I wish I'd made the move sooner. I really, really enjoyed it. But the point of the story about Benton and Bowles was we arrived, the 6 graduate trainees, and the next week, an entire planning department, they poached the entire planning department of an agency called Lintas. because that's what planning had started in the late 60s at two agencies in London, BMP and JWT, and had kind of had been sort of what's the word? It's almost incubating there for nearly a decade.
Stephen King was Stephen
JWT.
King, and who's the other guy? I forget his name now. The two guys who didn't work together.
Pollitt, right?
Oh,
No,
yes, they were considered the fathers of the creative brief. Stanley Pollitt, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those amazing things where, you know, there's not endless debate, but it was this thing that sort of a seed that germinated at the same time, almost the same time in two agencies. It's in two slightly different ways, it has to be said. But I mean, you know, but you're absolutely right. Stephen King, Stanley Pollitt, and but as it is where with these things, it took a while for it to go mainstream. But I joined the business just as planning was starting to go mainstream, and it was like some mad sort of sports team where, or sport where, you know, a couple of teams have they discover a new way of playing the game. It's a bit like Moneyball. And suddenly everyone, you know, you remember Moneyball, and the whole idea was then suddenly everyone had to have data analytics. It was like that with planning in the early 80s. It was like, oh my God. So people were actually bringing whole teams of planners. Or the other thing they did, which was very amusing, was that they had research departments, which overnight, they just changed the sign on the door. And so, you know, you had these slightly bemused middle-aged people who had been researchers who suddenly woke up one day to find they were now planners. They haven't got a fucking clue how to do it. And you know, but it was an interesting time of change to be in the business. But long story short, I spent the 80s as an account person, and then really from the early 90s onwards, I moved into planning, and as I said, I've never regretted it.
Well, it's funny that because I graduated exactly 10 years after you did from college, and I entered advertising, and I also was completely by chance. I had gone into a career in retail management, and then I had a health setback, and I was out of work for a couple of years, and I went back to school, was going to become a high school history teacher, and a buddy of mine who was working in an ad agency said, hey, why don't you come over here and work temporarily? And, you know, here I am 27 years later. So, but it was mid 90s, and planning had already reached the United States, but not that much longer before, right? So you talked about like the 60s, it starts in the UK, it really catches on in the 80s. By the early 90s, it's catching on at the big agencies in the US. And by the late 90s, even the small agencies like the one I was at were established. And I was the one that established our planning department at that agency. But it's interesting to see how the trend, you know, developed and then grew over time. And I think now nobody questions, you know, strategy department or planning department in the agency.
No.
Right. Michelle, let's hear your
go on. Sorry.
I want to get Michelle to tell her story. We'll continue the conversation, but
I mean, I had a kind of a similar story of not knowing what I wanted to do when I graduated, and then the path was chosen for me. I studied political science and economics. Had no idea what I was going to do with that degree. Realized that around kind of my third year, and started taking some marketing courses in business. And I decided I wanted to do something within that realm. I applied to a PR program actually at one of the colleges, and actually didn't get in. And so I started calling around a bunch of agencies, seeing if they would take any interns, and got in that way. And actually I started out on account management, and after some time, I actually it was about a year in Toronto, and I ended up moving to Sydney, to Australia. And I think I was very fortunate there to be able to move into strategic planning while I lived in Sydney. There's a ton of British expats who had just happened to set up, you know, agencies in Bondi Beach and all this sort of thing. And I think that's where I really kind of learned the foundational skills and cut my teeth. And it's actually where I first happened across the APG. It was a very strong chapter that they had out in Australia. And I just found, you know, the training and the networking. I mean, speaking of not knowing what the hell I was doing, because I was working at an agency, a digital agency at the time, which then decided that they wanted to have strategic planning as a service. They were finding this was back in the 2000s where they were turning TV ads into banner ads, and obviously wanted to move further upstream and just stop taking direction from the TV agency, the creative agency. So the chairman decided to make two of us account folks into planners, and we had no idea what that was. And he told us to go check out the APG. So we went and did that, and that's how I kind of found my way. And then after spending some time abroad, both in Sydney and in New York, moved back to Canada actually about 10 years ago. Actually, and that's when I first met Mark. And so I've been doing strategic planning for a while since then.
It is remarkable how often I hear, and Henry and I have talked about this, how people get into this industry backwards, stumbling into it by accident. I mean, that was the same way with me. I haven't really told my story that much, but it was the same thing with me. I didn't get my first copywriting job until I was 30 years old. And I was writing long copy for hospital brochures for stroke patients. And, and then I end up, my trajectory is that I ended up working for Tom Cordner at Team One on the Lexus business. He never liked me, but so what?
Yeah,
so David Ogilvy was, I think, a restaurant cook before he got into advertising. So
yeah. I think it's really important. And I think this is underestimated by young people today, because I think those who are really committed to the business, whether they want to be creatives or strategists or account folks, is this desire to jump right into the business. And I think it really benefits people to wait, in spite of the fact that it's an ageism, it's infected with ageism. And if you wait, that means your tenure is going to be much shorter, because with your exception, Mark, you've been obviously found a way to keep going. So many people just get aged out. They get let go because they're too expensive. They've been around too long. And if you do what I think is the best way to do this, wait, get some life experience like we all have, that just shortens your career. Would you agree?
Yeah. No. Well, I think. Well, first of all, yes. I mean, I won't name them because the names won't mean anything to the three of you. But I was always struck when my last job in the UK 10 years ago was as head of planning at Leo Burnett London, at the time a very top 5 agency. And it was a group of agencies, actually, a massive planning team, not by American standards. Well, I don't know, even by American standards. I mean, there were nearly 40 of us. 40, that's huge. Wow. And a fantastic job, really enjoyed it. But what was interesting was the best young planners by a country mile, in my opinion, were people who'd come to planning in their late 20s. One guy had worked in the music industry and in PR and as a journalist, and another was actually a fashion illustrator. And they've both gone on to really remarkable careers. And I do think that there is something, it's not just those two examples, but more generally, I think it is one of those things. I mean, I always say to young planners, it's much more challenging to be a young planner than a young account man. And I can say this having done both jobs, or having done both roles, not as a young person. And the problem with being a planner is that if you don't have an opinion, you're literally no use to anybody. You're no use to the creatives, you're no use to the account lead, you're no use to the account team.
And you can't have an informed opinion unless you have some life experience. Like
Exactly.
You could have an opinion, but then
Yeah.
you're just the kid at the table who's blabbing things that he has no knowledge about.
Absolutely. Whereas
maturity and observing, being, having been in other businesses, other things brings you a different perspective from the real world, rather than going straight from university into an agency, which is not a real world. You know what I mean? It's completely the opposite of the real world. And yes. I think what strategists bring a lot of that outside world in.
I think the key word in your phrase, Mark, is informed opinion. I mean, there's a lot of bloviating. There's a lot of, this is my belief, but I've got no way to verify this. Whereas someone with some life experience can say, we can verify this. This is measurable. We can test it. Huge difference.
Well, that's right. And I think the contrast with account management, and I'm, by the way, just for all my account management friends out there, I absolutely bow to no one in my worship at the altar of great account leadership. I think one of the biggest problems with the industry these days, it goes back to something Howard you was saying, is the great account leads are being chopped like wood for fires at Christmas. It's just shameful and shocking to see, and the industry is not better for that. But what I would say is that I remember my first job as an account management trainee all those years ago. One of the things we had to do was fill the cigarette boxes in meeting rooms, which feels almost like a track, that should come
It's
with a
ancient.
trigger warning now, shouldn't it? You know what I mean? But it's
I picked up the boss's dry cleaning.
yeah, exactly. But the point is, you can add value as a 23, 24-year-old account trainee by taking notes, pouring coffee, meeting clients, getting them taxis. There are no planning equivalents of any of that. There are just none. And so you sit there, and frankly, and I absolutely won't name names, but I've got a couple of people in mind who literally, well, not literally, sorry, but metaphorically shat the bed spectacularly in major meetings where they just opined, to Howard's point, and someone senior, not necessarily a client, in one case it was a creative, just turned around and said, "Oh, please shut up." Utterly embarrassing for everybody. Anyway, sorry, I've talked far too much.
No, that's okay.
We're
I'm
here to
interested
talk.
in- Yeah. What are your thoughts, Michelle? I mean, you haven't been around as long as Mark. But what are what's your assessment of how people and their experience are treated,
Yeah, I was
especially
also
in
gonna
account
say,
planning?
in terms of getting into the industry, there definitely wasn't Miami Ad School when I first started, and other kinds of schools like that, portfolio schools or whatever it may be, because I find that more and more it's almost becoming like you need to have that as a way to get in. I feel like it was a lot easier to get in some ways before. I mean, maybe it might have been different in the UK, but I think there were more kind of structured intern programs and you had to actually like qualify for them and stuff. But I managed to find a job at a university just by calling a whole bunch of agencies. I don't know that would work as well these days, having had no experience, and all I had to show was some like brand portfolio project that I had done in my class. So I feel for those who are moving in now, because I think the competition is a lot tighter.
I think intrepidity is underestimated in its role in getting a head start in our industry. I remember I was a copywriter in Chicago, and I had a week's vacation coming up, and I thought, I'm going to land a 1-week freelance gig or internship. I didn't care at a big LA agency. I had a friend I was going to come out and visit, and it's like I needed to get into something out there just to show them that I could do this, and I was prepared to do it for a week for free. And I didn't apply to Shy a Day. I applied to one of the other big shows. Maybe it's Deutsch. I forget which one it was. But I had a photograph of myself taken, and then I had it overlaid on a piece of big cardboard, and I cut it out so that it was life size. And I had it put into a very big FedEx package. And I had my hand, like holding my hand, and then I put a message on it and said, I'll give you a hand for free. Right. And I sent it to the creative director, and I said, I'm going to be there for a week. Put me to work. I'll do it. And he said no, only because I can't teach you the brand in a week, which I thought was BS, because it was an automotive brand. And it's like, how hard is it to learn an automotive brand? But I wasn't going to say that to him. But he never forgot me, and he always took my phone calls after that. So there's a degree of, if you have some gutsiness, if you're willing to just kind of stand out from the crowd. I don't know if that's true with account planners or account folks. I know it's true with creatives. Would you do something like that?
No.
Did you do something as gutsy like that for account planning, or?
No, I'm not saying there aren't, but I mean, Michelle and I think we've touched on this. I mean, we used to be colleagues at Taxi, one of the big agencies here in Canada. That's why I first met Michelle when I came to Canada 10 years ago, and we worked together for, I think, a couple of years. And so she may have heard this, but I do think that planners, I'm not a huge fan of Myers-Briggs, but that's a good, but that's the one everyone's heard of. So let's just go with it. I think if you were to do Myers-Briggs psychometric testing on planners, they would tend to fall into 2 out of the 16 boxes. I've never done it, but I think that goes to I do believe I've got a number of hobby horses. This is one. I do think that being a good planner, being a great planner, is extremely difficult. And I think too many people who don't make it as creatives or think account leadership is a bit too hard, think, oh, I'll try planning, like it's a kind of middle course. And in fact, planning, I think personally, I think the next big thing in planning is going to be saying, I'm sorry, you're not good enough to be a planner, just because you couldn't cut it doing something else. And I think it's partly because you need a different mental apparatus from being a creative. I'm not saying it's not creative or it doesn't have aspects of creativity, and it doesn't have aspects of some of the type A personality you see in the great account people, but it is a different skill set, and it relies on a different mindset, and that's why I in my experience, I think most planners will be very uncomfortable with doing something as ballsy as what you've just described, Howard. And that's not a bad thing. It's just because we're different.
Yeah, I think though that there is more. We're living in an age where there's more self-promotion in a way. Howard and I spoke in one of our recent episodes about planning portfolios, which didn't exist before. Like now, there's planning portfolios. You put your stuff out on your own personal website, your LinkedIn. So I think there is some more self-promotion. One brilliant idea that I stole actually from was a brilliant young copywriter named Larry Gordon at an agency that I worked at, and his email when he was like going through the hiring process was hirelarrygordon@gmail.com. Right. And so I created the email, and I still have it. I don't use it because I'm not actively looking for a job, but I have your new planner at gmail.com.
Right.
I still use that email with you sometimes, Henry.
Good for you. Good for you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are probably, as we speak, there are probably young planners who are basically honing their TikTok skills to get that next gig.
Yeah.
But you're right. I do think. I mean, this idea of whether you're a planner, a creative, or account person, this idea that actually the most important brand you manage is yourself, is I think something that really has taken off in the last 10 years, whether it's fully developed or not, and whether it ramifies, however it ramifies. I do think that that's a big mental shift for people in the industry. I agree.
I think because of the volatility of the industry, right? Because you can't expect to join a big network agency and spend 25 years there. You have to build a reputation. You have to, like you said, build a brand. Although I hate that idea of like human brands, but it in a way, you have to build a personal reputation and a style. Right, like we've seen. What's the name of our favorite guy on LinkedIn, Howard, the copywriter? I'm blanking on his name right now.
George Tannenbaum.
George Tannenbaum, who's brilliant. Like he's a freelance copywriter. Worked at big agencies his whole career. Got sick of it, and now he just promotes.
No,
himself.
He didn't get sick of it. They got sick of him, and they fired him.
They got sick of him, but I think he could have gone back, or somebody else would have hired him. I think he's a lot happier now.
Oh, absolutely a lot happier, right? I think he's on his little hobby horse, going against what's his name, Sorrell, and Ogilvy and that big network, because he can't stand that whole thing. But Henry and I have talked before in the past about some creatives just want to do the work, and there are some creatives who are more strategic. And when I started off with writing my books on the creative brief and then doing my workshops and training, I still say, even after all these years, I don't write briefs. I'm not a brief writer. I have written some briefs. I think I could probably write a pretty good brief, far better than I could 20 years ago when I first started off. But I had to learn what this thing was called a brief. I didn't know. I just knew that the briefs that I had read in the course of my career in ad agency world were mediocre at best, sometimes just awful. So I had to do some homework. And actually, Lance Saunders was my first mentor in the brief world, because he pointed me out to John Steele and to Sir John Haggerty. And of course, I read David Ogilvy and all these other writers. But I had to learn what this thing was called a brief. So this is my little subtle segue back into what we usually, when Henry and I love to talk about, which is briefs. How has your assessment of the brief changed over your years? Now, Michelle, you haven't been around as long, but you're still deeply involved in it. I'm going to guess you both write briefs. You both work with direct reports who write briefs. You do a lot of briefing. I'd like to hear your perspective on how this document and how the process of briefing and the attitude toward it has changed since you first got into the business. Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, so I've been in the business for 23 years. And I actually think the biggest shift that I've seen in briefs happened over COVID, actually. And I think it's really for the best, or for the good of the industry, because I started using a lot more of these collaborative tools, whether it be Miro or Google Slides or whatever it may be. And so for as long as we've been talking about collaboration with creatives and with account folks, there was still this very much this, you couldn't help yourself, baton process going on, where the account person would write the brief, sometimes a little bit in a vacuum, but it was great to be able to immerse yourself in the business and the brand and the culture and the consumer and all that sort of thing. And then kind of, you had this like masterpiece that you sweated over, and every single word and every phrase, and then you kind of, you know, presented it to the creatives, and either went one way or the other. Most often, you know, kind of fell flat because you'd fallen in love with it, and then you had to kind of sell it in. And I actually think what's happened now, where I feel like what I do more now is start to think about different ways in and different approaches, and start to almost kind of map those out on Miro in a much more collaborative way, and start to have these conversations much more early, well before pen goes to paper. And so then I feel like that having to kind of sell it in and convince people that this is the right direction happens less. And then also I feel as though the creatives feel less like they need to start at the beginning and do their own digging and figure out what they think is the best way in. And this whole, there was, I think, a sense before where it's like, okay, here's a brief, good thing, put it aside and let's actually go see what we think. So in some ways it's become, well, a hell of a lot more collaborative and efficient in a way, because we're all coming together much more early on.
And doesn't that take pressure off of you, Michelle?
Yeah, I also think it makes it a hell of a lot more fun, because
yes,
you have these conversations early on, and often arrive at a much better place. I think it reminds me of, I remember, you know, oftentimes you'll go to a client briefing and you'll be talking about the brief on the way back in the cab or whatever to the agency back in the day when we used to do that. And you could get like 3/4 of the way there, like a good 80%, you'd have it cracked, like not fully, obviously, but you'd have a good discussion,
a good start,
align on actually what the actual problem is and what you think the focal point should be. And it was oftentimes the best use of time, you know, those half hour back to the agency.
Yeah, the mural is the tool that I use in my training. And there are lots of them out there, lots of whiteboards, real-time whiteboards. So whatever it is that you use almost doesn't matter. Just the fact that you're using it brings all the players together. And that's the backbone of my training, is the idea of collaborating, because the document's written for us, for creatives. Why shouldn't I have a say in it? Why should I get involved? And Henry has talked about this a lot. He never just springs a brief on the creatives. He always runs it by his creative director and maybe a couple of other senior creatives, because it produces a better document and better ideas. Mark, what about you? How has your views of the brief evolved since the 18th century when you got started? I started in the 17th century because I'm older than you.
It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry. Teasing is totally allowed. Gosh,
they call it bullying now.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to be canceled. Look out.
Hang on, HR. No, I feel it's such an interesting topic, and so I know that's just sounds like I'm figuring out what I want to say. I actually have been thinking about this, knowing that we were going to have this conversation. And I think, first of all, I completely agree with what Michelle said. I do think that COVID has, in so many ways, transformed our industry, and I think actually largely for the better. I think in terms of working practices and the working from home and all that sort of stuff, if that's your gig, but also the collaborative nature of it. I think that's completely agree with that. I think for me, I think one of the things that I've always struggled with, and I think I've resolved it actually in the course of the last couple of weeks thinking about this. So let me explain the problem, and then I'll come back to what I think is the solution or the confounding issue at the heart of it. One of the things that I found difficult when I came to Canada was that there seemed to be an expectation of planners which was radically different to that I'd grown up with in the UK. So for instance, in the UK, you know, planners have been at the table all my career. You know, the metaphor I use, which is a really boring analogy, which is the three-legged stool. Every single decent agency in Britain that has gone on to any kind of success since Bartleby or Hegarty started in 1982 had a planner, an account lead, and a creative team at their heart as principals in the agency. And I think I can say that without exception. The Saatchi brothers don't count. Moving off that. Not true in Canada. Not even true now in Canada. It's extraordinary to me. I don't know if it's true in the US. Obviously, it's a much bigger ad scene there. But so I'd grown up with a world where planners always had a seat at the table and were respected. They weren't always agreed with, and I've been privy to some really extraordinary. I've watched rows and I've been part of rows. So you know, lots of strongly held opinions, but no doubt that you couldn't review the creative work without a planner in the room. You know, you couldn't. You know, there were meetings that just couldn't happen unless all three disciplines were represented. When I came to Canada, what I found was this, I think it's a very different economic model, won't bore you with that. But I found that there was this thing, and I found it even at Taxi, which I'd never come across before, which was, well, what's planning for? What are you for? What value are you adding? And I felt often, even as the head of the planning department, and then the CSO, that you know, there were some of my colleagues who just wished I'd morph into an into an art director or a copywriter, and that everyone would be happier. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think there is a confusion in the industry, and I think it's a really problematic confusion around the word insight. I'm sure you've talked about this before on your podcast, because
most overused, misunderstood word in advertising.
Absolutely, completely agree, Henry. But bear with me, because I think I can. Well, I hope I can shed some light, because it's been puzzling me for a long time, and where I've got to on this is this: I think there are, certainly in Canada, there are far too many clients who want their agencies to do what's called insight mining. I mean, you know, this for me lives in the same box as the personal brand. You know, I just want to self-harm when I hear people talk about insight mining, and I think the idea that, but forget the phrase. I think the idea is that in every market, if only the brand could discover fresh insights, you know, newly ordered in from Whole Foods, we'd be able to move past the sort of the wallpaper or whatever, you know, the conventional wisdom in the category into a new creative space and start doing amazing advertising. And this, of course, falls down on its face, because, you know, if you've grown up in a country like the UK, where, you know, you can actually see great advertising. Certainly it used to be the case. And I'm not saying UK advertising better than anyone else. It just happened to be the one I grew up with. The culture I know best was that, you know, actually there were lots of it was accepted that often the difference between the brands would be the quality of the advertising, not the quality of the insight, the strategic insight. And I think one of the problems is that we think there's one kind of insight, and I would argue that in all great advertising there are two. I think there's a strategic insight, which is, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering, but I think that's the planner's role. That's and you know, again, I'm not ignoring or disagreeing.
I have a feeling I know where you're heading, and you're a man after my own heart. But keep going.
So I'm not saying that the brief isn't a collaborative process. I'm just saying there are two different types of insight. I don't care who comes up with them. And I think we need to get better at managing clients' expectation, particularly younger clients who aren't very experienced, because there's a whole issue of the quality of clientele in our business, which is another whole fucking podcast or series of podcasts, right? But it seems to me the confusion so there are two levels. There's a strategic insight, and this is the killer, there is a completely separate process, which I would call the creative insight. So this is, and this was best summed up for me about 3 or 4 years ago when I was at TBWA, and I had the just happened to work with Peter Suter, who's a very famous creative from the UK, and now I think retired or semi-retired, but absolute genius, living in the same space as Hegarty, you know. And he said, I love planning. He said, because planning to me, he said to me, Mark, the crucial thing is, and he said this in front of the whole agency, and I thought it was so useful, and more Canadians need to hear this, in my experience, more Canadian ad people. You are the springboard, we are the dive. And I love that metaphor, because it means you both have roles, they're both important, but they're essentially different, but you need both to pull off something stunning and memorable and distinctive. And I get very frustrated with Canadian marketing people and creatives who seem to think that if the insight in the brief isn't a creative insight, it's not a good brief. And you go, no, that's your fucking job, not mine. You know, it's like, you know, those people, and I've done it myself, and I knew I was wrong to do it. But you know, those people who give, you've probably seen them, conference speeches on insight, and they use clips from Seinfeld, either Jerry as a stand-up or from Seinfeld itself. And what they're doing is they're pretending that creative insight is the same thing as strategic insight, and it's not. Strategic insight is not some aha moment like the famous donut holes thing, you know, where he goes, you know, donut holes, what's that all about? And it's brilliant. If you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. It's stunning. But the point is, you're kind of going, that's not a strategic insight. That's a creative insight. That's what creative geniuses do. And by the way, I'm not blowing smoke out. I'm just saying, I'm sure you were a creative genius in your time. But the point is, that is a completely different kind of insight from strategic insight. And the confusion of the two leads to this kind of paralysis of almost like cretinous. And I use the word advisedly, you know, almost lame-brained, limping around looking for insight as if you know, it was the treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. I call what you call the creative insight, which I actually like is a better name for it, an executional insight, right? Like the strategic insight is, how do people interact with this brand or this category or this problem that our product solves, whatever that is. And sometimes there could be something eye-opening and new, but for the most part, it's stuff that every competitor knows, right? You go and you do the focus groups, you look at the quant, and everybody's got kind of the same information, and they know what consumers say about a thing. How you relate that to life in a humorous way, in an emotional way, in a sad way, you know, however way, that's a different thing. And that's where the magic of advertising happens. It doesn't happen on the creative brief. It happens in the mind of the creative as it thinks, oh, I could take that premise now and take it in this absurd direction, or in this really comforting direction, or whatever that is. I use humor because a lot of the best advertising and most memorable tends to be humorous, but it doesn't always have to be humorous, right? Like some
and that's what I loved your analogy, or the analogy you cited about the diving board and the dive. I like to say that the creative brief is the spark and creative is the flame. You have to start with the spark. Without a spark or without an inspiration, which, you know, the title of my book is How to Write an Inspired Creative Brief. Somebody pointed out it should be inspiring, whatever. It's the same idea. I can't change the title now because it's been out since 2009, Equity. But I mean, I have seen examples of briefs where facts have been used in place of insights. They never go beyond facts, or maybe it's an observation, but it never gets beyond that. And Henry and I've had conversations about this before. It's considered the holy grail, but few ever achieve it.
But and I think it puts too much pressure on a brief writer to come up with something that nobody's ever seen before, and that, you know, and you know how many times I've seen on agency evaluations, we need more fresher insights. It's like, no, what you need is to open your mind to some of the ideas that we're bringing to the table, because it's really in the creativity. So you're a man after my own heart in that regard. Now, something we touched on a little bit was training, and kind of that you guys, we talked a little bit before we started recording about the APG in Canada. I don't think we've talked about it since we started recording. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the APG in Canada? And because, as you said, we don't have one here in the States, and you know, in the UK, it's a very important group, and in the UK, I think they just take advertising a lot more seriously. There's the IPG,
Yeah.
I mean, the IPA, the APG. So talk a little bit about that, because I think the state of training especially at agencies these days for strategists is pretty lame in the States.
Well, I think it's pretty lame everywhere, to be honest, Henry, because I think of the budgetary issues that we've already alluded to. Yeah, I mean, the APG, very briefly, the account planning group was started just like planning. I suppose the logic is, planning started in the 60s. And I think the APG, if I'm roughly right anyway, started in the 80s in the UK, and has flourished. And it's quite a big and serious operation there. It's not as big and serious as the IPA, because the IPA, just like the 4As, will always have the kind of the big money from the big agencies. And we'll come on to the IPA in a minute, actually, because that's relevant to what we're doing in the training space. But yeah, so the account planning group started there, and it's, as Michelle's already mentioned, there's a flourishing one in Australia. I mean, basically, being slightly mischievous. I mean, you can sort of, as British planners spread across the world, the diaspora took with them APGs, which either took root and flourished or didn't. And I think there are about 5 or 6 going reasonably well. Ours didn't start until about 10 years ago, and was actually ironically started by 2 Brazilian emigres to Canada, who, because in fact, one of the big non-APG planning groups is in Brazil. I'll butcher the Portuguese, so I won't even go there, but it basically is the Portuguese for the group of planners in Brazil. And that's quite a flourishing thing. And they came to Canada and thought that Canada, looked around, they thought, well, Canada should have the same thing. They looked for the English brand equivalent, APG Canada. They're no longer involved, but they really, we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. And the APG, as you know, is a trade association, but we don't get involved with government or lobbying or anything like that. Our job, just like the APG in the UK, is basically to raise the level, raise the bar of planning in Canada. And inevitably, to your point, Henry, that then touches on training. And training is really problematic in our industry now. It really is. Because of the lack of money for the big agencies. And I think where we've netted out, and I think we're in quite a good spot actually now. And again, it's interesting. Michelle was talking about the effects of COVID. I mean, COVID nearly brought about the premature death of the APG Canada, because our entire income stream and revenue was predicated on people getting into rooms to have events, and training in rooms and events in rooms. And we really struggled for 18 months. And then we've reinvented ourselves as basically a virtual operation now. A lot of it thanks to Michelle. I'm not going to spare her blushes, with her podcast series and various other things. But one of the things that we did about before COVID was we became the representative in Canada for the IPA. We license their training and sell it here. And of course, it's actually perfect. It's perfect for Canada, second biggest country in the world. You can have an APG. We're headquartered in Toronto, but actually it's a real challenge. You can't have chapters in every Canadian city. But with the IPA's online training, we can offer world-class training all over Canada, even if you live in Whitehorse. And
Medicine Hat.
Medicine Hat, yeah, let's throw some names out there. Iqaluit, you can do it all. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only limit, which I have to be slightly careful, because I don't want to offend my friends in Quebec, were they to be listening to this, is that it's all in English. But of course, I mean, one of the interesting things is that Quebec is, very much young people in Quebec are basically bilingual. So, while we'd love to offer things in French, in reality, in our industry, it's not a barrier to people consuming that content. And in many ways, that alliance we have with the IPA is one we're very proud of, and one which is starting to bear fruit, because going full circle on this, actually, online high quality training is also extraordinarily good value for money. Getting people into rooms, paying expenses, staying overnight, paying the trainer, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That model just isn't going to fly in our industry anymore. Or if it does, it'll be quite rare, and it'll tend to be very high end for senior management. But for the people who need it, the young people under 30 coming into the industry, there's a huge void where training should be.
Well, Michelle, tell us about the podcast. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So we have a podcast called Grow Up. We thought it would attract some listeners with that title. And it's an opportunity that we provide strategists to grow once a week. So we bring in different guest speakers. Some have been strategists, but they don't have to be. Some have even been outside the industry. We've also gone outside of Canada. We've spoken to folks in the UK and the US. But it's been on any number of topics. Actually, we are just in the middle of a series right now called APG Canada 10. So it's our 10th year anniversary this year. And so we asked some folks in the industry to talk about or reflect on how strategic planning in Canada has changed over the last 10 years and what might be in store for the next 10. So that's been super interesting. We also have an upcoming series. While we do a lot of things virtually, we are really happy to be back in person and having some in-person events. In fact, we had a couple this month in May. We had one just recently called Canada Versus, and we were reflecting on the differences between strategic planning in Canada versus other markets. And so we invited a bunch of expats, creatives and strategists who had worked in other markets, UK, Dubai, where else? Cape Town and other places, to ask them how they see strategic planning differently, how it's valued differently here. And so now we're going to continue and do a podcast series off the back of that as well, to speak to other people who might have an opinion on what Canadian strategic planning can offer to the industry.
That's
Right.
awesome. You know,
Yeah.
Mark, I would push back just a little bit, because I work for the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers. I'm on their faculty for their Marketing, Training, and Development Center. I'm one of about 70 to 80 instructors. And COVID shut us all down from our travel. So we moved everything online, which is, I think that is a truth that's universal. And that's not going to change. But as Michelle just alluded to, and you also did yourself, there is a desire to get back to face-to-face, into live in-person events. And I'm doing more traveling for the ANA and on my own, because there's no comparison when you do training face-to-face than when you do it online. You can't read the body language of your student. You can't look at them, give them a dirty look when they're checking their phones online, when you can do that in person.
I think there's benefits and drawbacks to both, but to
True.
Mark's point, I think you might have access to better quality online, because the scalability of it makes it more accessible from a price standpoint.
Absolutely.
and
there are companies there.
Me speaking as a two-time alumnus of Mark Ritzen's mini MBA courses, right? Where, I wouldn't have been able to afford to travel to the UK and spend a few weeks with him there to do the course, but I could do it from the comfort of my own home on my own time.
Well, lots of companies have people who are now working from home, and they have taken advantage of this opportunity, and they've scattered. So they're not just living outside the city in the suburbs, they're living in a different state sometimes, or in a different country. So the opportunity to get together is not as likely. So when I do virtual training, it's often across many time zones. So that's an absolute fact that I don't think is going to change. But it is nice to see more in-person activities returning. And I've done some speaking engagements I'm in Texas now, but out of Texas because of that. Nevertheless, what you are doing, I think, is vitally important. And it's really kind of sad that we don't have an equivalent here in the United States. We've got the 4As, we've got the ANA, we've got the AMA, the American Marketing Association. I know there's a chapter in Vancouver, because I've been up there to do a training in Vancouver. What are can you tell us about some of the upcoming events on your calendar? Virtual or in person, or both?
Yeah, we actually are in chats with another agency. It's great. We're actually getting agencies reaching out to us now saying that they want to host different events. So we haven't kind of nailed down all the details, but we are in chats with one agency. And one of the topics, unsurprisingly, that came up again and again in this series about kind of, how strategic planning has changed over the last 10 and what might be in store for the next, there was a big theme, a lot of conversation around DE&I. For obvious reasons, and what we can do in strategic planning to kind of help further that conversation along. Obviously, it's a massive topic, but I think there's something really interesting even in, why are the conversations happening at the moment of casting, for example? Shouldn't these be happening much further upstream? Why are there even multicultural agencies to some degree? I had a conversation with someone who worked in Dubai about that, and they said, well, why are there multicultural agencies in North America? That seems like a bizarre kind of thing. And even thinking about some multicultural agencies where it's almost like digital agencies 20 years ago. They're not part of the IAT.
Well, I'd love to have a full discussion with you about that, being that I work at a multicultural agency and I've forged an entire career at multicultural agencies. So, but I think it's a long topic to discuss the how and the why of multicultural agencies in the States.
Yeah, and I remember when I first moved to LA, I took a portfolio class from a young, well, he was old, he was a young Black creative director whose name is now escaping me, but he passed away just a year or so ago, and he was famous, beloved teacher. It was the Mike Whitlow. His name was Mike Whitlow, and he had a portfolio class, and I created my LA network by taking that class and meeting all the creative directors who came in to do a presentation. So, and he was the creative director for a Black ad agency. That was my point. I kind of got lost on that. So that was a multicultural. Actually, it was a not multicultural. It was a Black ad agency. Yeah, it had multiple ethnicities represented in its staff, but they focused entirely on
the Black audience.
Black brand, the Black audience. Yeah.
That is a big difference between Canada and the US, I think. And again, I'm absolutely, well, it's not something one would take sides on. I think it's very interesting. And as Henry said, it's part of a much bigger conversation. One thing I would say, again, and this is one of Michelle's initiatives, so I'll mention it rather than leaving it to her. But in terms of what's coming up, one of the things that I'm personally proudest of is that we're starting, and we've wanted to do this for a while, but we're finally starting to get involved with colleges in Toronto. I mean, one of the things with Toronto, and it's very different from the States, is, I mean, Toronto really is, it's the old Canadian joke. I mean, people outside Toronto call it, not in a nice way, the center of the universe, because apparently that's what Torontonians think they are. But there are some fantastic advertising colleges here. And one of the things that we started to do, and I'm hoping we're going to do more of them, is actually have partnerships between the APG and on some of their courses in the advertising space, particularly around obviously strategy, and helping add value to those courses and in ways that benefit us and them. And that, for me, the reason why I'm so excited about that is not just as a revenue opportunity, although it is, but actually because it goes back to the very heart of what we're trying to do, and that's raise the bar for planning. And one of the things I want to do is, as part of that, is both manage younger people's expectations about the rigor behind being a planner. It's not, as I said earlier, it's not just something you do because you can't be a creative and you can't be a account person. It's actually a positive job choice, and it's a positive career choice for the right people. But also it's a way of actually starting to raise the bar with people who are still in their teens, and as they grow into it. So instead of starting to do the training about best practice and talk, and all those good things and access to the great brains, in planning in Canada, you can actually get it when you're 19 or 20 at college. And I think that does two things. One is it actually makes you understand what's involved intellectually, but also, to use a word Howard used a few minutes ago in a different context, hopefully will inspire young people as to what they can look forward to in a planning career in advertising.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. Mark Tomblin and Michelle Lee, Senior Leadership of APG Canada, thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers.
Thank you.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.